This is our fifth week, our second to last week of Revelation study. And this week we're going to look at chapters 12 to 18. Now, there's a fair bit of repetition in the format. So, the first time we looked at seven scrolls, and then we got to seven trumpets. So, this week we get to seven bowls, and the same kind of idea. Destruction is poured out, and there's not a whole lot of mourning for the loss in heaven. But I'm gonna back up a little bit. So, chapter 12 starts with the woman who is pregnant. She's not given any name or any identity, and a lot of modern, I guess maybe not modern, but Middle Ages Victorian thinking associated with her with Mary, because the whole idea of being birthed, and then the story we have in Matthew of the Romans coming for Jesus to kill him kind of resonated with the story that John tells us about this pregnant woman. But more modern thought on that is suggests that she's actually Eve, the mother of all nations. And there's parallels between her story and the story of Isis and the story of Leto and other mythologies around the area. No matter how you try, none of the Hebrew books, none of the peoples can get away from the mythological, the religious communities around them. In this day and time, in first century Palestine, there's no philosophical concept of religion. They can't isolate their belief structure and say this is ours and this is yours. There's a little bit of overlap and intermingling, and each other's myths influence each other. So there's no clean isolation. So it's little wonder that John brings up images that are shared across various mythological traditions and have found their way into the lore almost of the Hebrew tradition. Now, if you watched my video on Judeo-Christian myths, you'll know that myth does not make it untrue. Myth does not make it less sacred. Myth just is a shared language with others and trying to figure out how the world works when they don't necessarily have scientific language or historical language that we fall back on. So we start with the pregnant woman, who is really the only positive representation of a woman in the entire book of Revelation. It's one of the things that kind of makes it hard to choke back when you're just a woman reading it, or a feminist scholar having to go through it. Women are very negative in Revelation. There's no two ways about it, and a lot of that has to do with John being in a scene. We assume there's no outright guarantee that he is. There's no complete explanation of even what group of Essenes or what was going on, because the best we have from the Essene community is the Dead Sea Scrolls that talked about a group of people who were no longer alive by the time John came through. Essenes would have morphed to something else, but there's a good thought process with most ancient historians that the Essenes were kind of absorbed into the Christian tradition when it first started to emerge. That the followers of Jesus was something that the Essenes saw as their natural progression. The other part of that, of course, is that they were a celibate group of people. So they didn't produce or raise their own children. So they'd have no one to pass on the tradition to. And eventually, over time, and we see this in parts of our society that are totally enclosed in one gender or one ideology, is over time you start to look at anything outside of that with great suspicion. So a more modern example is the men's clubs during the Victorian era. If you do any real history of women, you will learn that women in the Middle Ages were not as meek and mild. The whole princess and knight on shining armor thing, that never happened. That was story. Women ran businesses and did all sorts of stuff right through the Reformation. They were everywhere. It's not until we hit the Victorian era where these men's clubs developed and they sat around deciding what women were like that we start to see women having more of their rights and freedoms taken away. So if we go back 2,000 years, we have John, who arguably is an Essene, who sees women as something he's scared of, something that's going to ruin his tradition or take away from what he thinks is of value. He would have seen the women who were in leadership in the church and have quite dismay at that concept. So women are something he can very easily translate into something negative and something evil and something against the church as he thinks it needs to be. That comes up again and again in these 6 chapters that we're looking at. And as I said, from a feminist perspective, it's extremely difficult. It's tedious to read. But we have the pregnant woman right at the beginning who is very positive because she only gives birth. That's about all she does. She is then quickly taken away in nature, and we don't hear from her again. And it brings up the whole divide between mother and whore that that a lot of Revelation wants to hinge on. In fact, way too much of the Christian tradition has hinged on this whole role that women can either be a mother or a whore, that there's nothing in between. There's certainly not any development of who they are as people. And that's our great loss, because it takes scholars to go back in history and find out examples where the church didn't have this attitude. Revelation is not the place for that. Revelation definitely maintains this attitude and almost encourages it. And one of the challenges the pregnant woman has is the beast comes in. Now, this is the part I said that mentioned that they connect with early Matthew and Rome, or the emperor coming in to take Jesus from Mary when he was born. We have the story of the dragon coming in to take away the baby. God intervenes and protects the child, and the mother gets away, and the baby is safe. But the dragon is very, very definitely meant to be Rome. It's an offshoot of the snake that we first see in the story of Eve and various other places. So the snake morphs into a dragon creature. In fact, if you look at some medieval art around the snake in the Garden of Eden, that snake has wings. So the two are related quite a bit in pre-scientific culture as far as the imagery of what evil would look like. And along with the dragon, then comes beasts. And they start to fight this war with God. And this is something that many people who see Revelation as predictive are waiting for, this grand battle between God and evil. And it, unfortunately, takes away a lot of the Christian message, because if that's your focus, if your focus is on the grand battle to rid the world of all evil, then you're not really paying attention to what Jesus has to say. And Jesus has to say things like, get in there, take care of people, clothe them, house them, feed them, be in there, be doctors for them, take care of each other because God loves you. That's not the message we get in Revelation. And so the holy war happens. It doesn't last long. The bad side is routed, but more of the beast information comes out, and one of the things that comes out is the beast has a number, 666. Now, I was hearing a story just the other day about a woman who was at a store and rang up the items, and it cost her $6.66, so she had to add something else to it just to make sure it was a different number. We're kind of crazy about that number, and it's unfortunate because it is not a number meaning anything other than Nero, Emperor Nero. We've gone over a couple of times Gematria, the Jewish numerology system. One of the parts of Gematria is looking at 7, what 7 means, and 3 means, and 10 means over and over again. But another part of that is that all the letters in the Hebrew alphabet have numerical value. So you add that up, and that gets you the number. So if you add up Kaiser Neron, it gives you 666. And one of the interesting parts about that is some of the early versions of Revelation have the beast number at 616, so 616. If you take the N off of Kaiser Neron and only have it Kaiser Nero, it adds up to 616. This is who we're talking about. It's not meant to be a mystery to first century Christians who were reading this and identifying all this evil with the Roman government. It was very, very clear to all of them. And regardless of whether you position, if you look at Rome, the dating of Revelation in around 60, or if you date it around 90. And we've had that conversation a bit, how scholars aren't really sure, but somewhere in there. Nero was a huge influence because it was around 50, 48, I believe, that he kicked all the Hebrews and a lot of the Christ followers out of Rome and sent them somewhere else in the Mediterranean. So that memory is still fresh, it's still raw. You're only 1 or 2 generations around being blamed for something that he did himself. Um, and so there's a great deal of distrust. Not only that, but of course the fact that you're a conquered peoples trying to get your freedom, and this hideous power of war and destruction just keeps pushing you down. So there's no love lost for the Hebraic folks or the early Christian followers for Nero. They don't want to have anything to do with him. So he is definitely the beast. The lesser beast is seen as um, Roman administration. And if you read through the passages, it talks about bringing order and making the orders of the beast happen. I mean, that's legal government's administration. Part of the challenge of that, of course, is that a lot of the Christ followers worked in the Roman government. They worked for Roman companies. You couldn't not extract that. And one of the themes through um, John's stories of destruction is a complete disregard for what happens to people who are not part of his special 144,000. What happens to them? What happens to their livelihood? The vision is not at all compassionate for other people who are just like him, who have to make a living. So that kind of gets repeated through Revelation numerous times. So we have the pregnant woman, and we introduce the beasts, the dragons, and whatnot, and now the 7 bulls. So 7 bulls is patterned on the same pattern that we saw with the scrolls and the trumpets. The first 4 happen in quick succession. They're very destructive. Get it over with. Then there's a break. And then there's 2 more that are even more destructive. And then there's a pause. Now, seemingly the pauses are for people to repent and come to the fold and whatnot. But there's not a whole lot of time in there for that to happen. There's certainly no reaching out for that to happen. And then we get to the last bowl. Now, if you follow the pattern of the trumpets and the scroll, the last part was a worship experience. So grateful that they're in heaven. That's not what happens with the 7 bowls. The 7 bowls were immediately cast into Babylon and the whore of Babylon. And this is where it gets really hard for women to read, but also gets very historical and very specific. Babylon was huge significance in the lives of the people of Judea, particularly. So the Assyrian captivity and exile happened around 650, 700, maybe onward back, BCE. And you can look at what happened to the Lost 10 Tribes video to get a better explanation of that. But they were lost, or they're removed from the equation by this point in time. So by 600 BCE, it was really the Judeans. And Benjamin was down there at the bottom, but basically it was the large tribe of Judah that was responsible for Jerusalem and carried the tradition. The Babylonians came in and destroyed the first temple. And they took off the learneds and the rich from the land, and they took them back to Babylon. And they were there for about 100 years. When the Persians came in and took over, they freed the Judeans to go back, and they also gave them money to rebuild their temple and expectations. And you get a lot of racism involved in that. So if you look at the book of Ezra or Nehemiah at the very end, you see comments where they have to get rid of their non-Judean wives, send them back because we have to have purity in the land. So that's the framework that the Second Temple is built under. Money from a foreign government and cultural and ethnic purity to maintain it. And it's that purity that the Sadducees and the Pharisees inherit, as well as the Essenes, and inherit, that eventually Jesus' community comes into. And there's been pushbacks around that, of course, but generally the Sanhedrin, those who were in charge in the Second Temple, wanted to keep very strict rules, very strict codes of conduct for all of their followers. And they carried Babylon as a metaphor of how bad it had been, that they don't want to go back there again. Now, they also carried Egypt, and we hear in the story of Exodus why that was an issue for them. But Babylon carries special significance in the memories of the Hebrew folk. And they talk about the horror of Babylon. Again, this is John's distrust of women and his complete conviction that women are the form that will tear down a righteous man and lead to his destruction. So we first meet the horror of Babylon, and she's sitting on a beast with 7 heads, and she's sitting amongst a mountain, 7 mountains, and there are 7 kings. Well, again, the 7, the number of completion. But coincidentally, Rome was in a valley surrounded by 7 mountains. So right away, the readers and listeners to Revelation would have got that reference right off the hop. And the 7 kings, scholars can't agree with when to start counting the kings. And of course, if we date Revelation earlier, then you're getting a different set of emperors than if you date it later. So there's no agreement on who the 7 kings are, or even if John is talking about 7 eras. And one of the really hard things to help folks understand who want to read Revelations as predictive is that they use these 7 kings and assign modern leaders to them. So Stalin was a king, Hitler was a king, Mussolini was there, Reagan was there. I'm sure others were there. So they're trying to take the symbolism of Revelation and put it into modern equation and see if it fits. And of course it doesn't, but people keep looking for that, as if this is a sign and signal. The thing is, it can't possibly be a signal of modernity because John was not writing for the 21st century. But on top of that, we don't even know if he was writing for the community in the 60s or the 90s of the Common Era. So who he wanted to reference might have held significance that now has been lost to time. The only one really that we can pull out and identify is Nero, and that's with the Mark of the Beast. Getting back to the Mark of the Beast also, one of the things that slave culture in Roman times included was a marking, much like the Holocaust. Slaves were marked. They couldn't escape. They couldn't run off. They couldn't pretend they weren't. They were marked and everybody could see it. So that's also part of the mark of evil that people were carrying. This is ownership by the most wicked government in the world. You were essentially bought and sold property of pure evil. So you were marked as a beast. Whore of Babylon, yeah. I'm not even sure how to respond to a lot of the reckoning of the Whore of Babylon, the whole sexual demonization of the symbol of destruction, because the Whore of Babylon is meant to be Rome as well. That she just takes in cultures. Fornication, we come across often. Fornication is not just sleeping around. Fornication was also idolatrous behavior. So if you worshipped other gods, if you taught about them, if you ate meat that was offered, sacrificed to gods. So again, poor people having very few options in the market would sometimes be stuck eating meat sacrificed to gods. In John's estimation, that is partaking in the great evil that is Rome. So when you read fornication, it's not just a sexual act. It's also very much about worshiping in ways that are not the way we're supposed to with Christ. And one of the biggest problems with all of that is that sexual accusations was a very common thing in that day and age. If you wanted to dismiss people, if you wanted to undermine them, you accuse them of sexual acts. And you know what? We really haven't changed that much. Look at today's politicians. You can tumble some really good people working for social change just by accusing them of sexual impropriety. Now, the irony of that is you cannot topple some really hideous people based on sexual immorality, and I'm really not sure what that's all about, but it's kind of disconcerting. Um, the sorry, I'm going through my notes here. The end, we have a celebration. So this is mirroring what does happen with the seventh seal and the seven trumpets. It also mirrors what happens with the story of Miriam and the dance of Miriam and Deborah afterwards. It's very common throughout the Hebrew scriptures to see people offer up this song of celebration and praise, and basically repeats the experience that they had just happened. Their enemies were vanquished, God was on their side, nothing was left, there was blood and gore, and they were victorious, and isn't that wonderful? There's quite a few psalms that also follow this pattern. So this sense that they have the right to be victorious. And again, as I said at the beginning of last week's review of the scriptures, when you're an oppressed people, you are not really interested in showing compassion to others who benefit from the system that oppresses you. And privileged folk like me have a really hard time getting into that headspace. I respect it for what it is, but it's very hard for me to take that concept to revelation when I haven't lived it. So as much as John annoys me and bothers me with his reflection and treatment of women, I also at the same time have to recognize he is working from a place of oppression that I'm never going to be. So I have to kind of keep that open intention. Now, getting back to the treatment of women, because we cannot leave this section without just trying to work with that and reconcile with that. And quite frankly, I think even reconcile is the wrong word. We have to be aware that treatment of women, the disparity of women, is more or less contained to the written word and the social word. Because if you look at the genuine history of this time and place, women were in leadership all over the place. Women were educators. In fact, women were largely responsible for the spread of Christianity. So what John wants to do, this very narrow version that blames women for everything, is not representative. And I think that's part of his frustration, is that his view of purity is the desire to have that as the expression of Christianity is not being lived. It's not what he's seeing around him, and he is angry about that. And that comes out especially in his talk about women. And there's one reference of 14:4, I think, where it praises men who have remained virgins because they're untainted by women. So there's some real personal stuff going on. So I encourage you to separate out John's words from what was going on historically. Way too often, people just stop when they read something in the Bible that is negative towards women and think that is the be all and end all. In fact, any historian can tell you, I can tell you, any of us can. Just because that is the attitude they have in literature and philosophy does not mean that's the attitude they had in society. Most people writing, John included, were in the privileged place, now oppressed, but still in the place where others took care of their needs. Socrates, Plato, so many, Augustine, so many others in Christian history. They were wealthy men who had the time to sit around and consider things. They weren't raising children. They weren't worrying about their meals. All of that was catered to them. So they can sit and pontificate to their heart's content. That was not real life then any more than it was real life now. Real life was men and women on the ground making life work for the rest of society and growing community. So regardless of what John records or fantasizes or fears when it comes to the role of women, that was not representative of the actual church. This is still a vision he has that is heavily influenced by his own personal perspective. And as much as apocryphal literature is a genre, and he talks about visions, visions get fed through our own personal experiences and biases. So that's what we have here. So if you are tripped up by the horror of Babylon and the despicable depiction of women in Revelation. I encourage you just to let it go, or stand back, or take some time, do some more reading, but don't let that define Christian scripture or Christian attitude, because it was not. There were far more people on the ground, women and men on the ground, teaching each other, worshiping with each other, and banging out greater theology than what John was dealing with. So that brings us to the end of week 5. Next week we'll be wrapping it up. I really am thankful that you have taken this walk through Revelation with me. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is a summary read. This is not in depth. It is a very deep book with so much additional symbolism that I haven't even been able to touch on. It is something that is part of our Christian heritage, but it is not something that is going to define how we develop as a tradition. We're developing along far more inclusive lines than John wants to give us.